Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Jordan Jacobs with Veeam. I'm the Senior Director of Global Cloud Solutions. Joining me today is Everett from AWS.
Yeah, I'm Everett Dolgner. I'm on the Technical Business Development team for storage at AWS.
Very cool. So diving straight in today, I always like to talk about Veeam first. So Veeam is the #1 availability solution for any app, any data, and any cloud. And that doesn't matter if the cloud is on-premise, using VMware or Hyper-V at your data centers, with one of our thousands of managed service providers, or even at a public cloud like AWS. And one of the more common use cases is actually backing up software as a service applications like Office 365. And what the Veeam Availability Platform does is that ties it all together, because again, it's your app, it's your data, and it's your responsibility. So it's important that no matter who hosts your data, that you have an availability strategy that keeps you protected. And it's one of the reasons we're here today is because the AWS archival services are really fantastic. They're low cost and they're very, very reliable. So let's dive in and start by talking a little bit about tape. Tape is old. I don't even have to go over a whole lot about why tape is terrible, because everybody knows it. It's this incredibly old legacy technology. It's hard to deal with. It's hard to use. And your entire ability to recover is entirely dependent. This is kind of a joke I make, but it's really dependent on this little paper label, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If that label peels off, good luck finding your tape around among countless rows looking like an old Blockbuster. I mean, it's just completely impossible. And people go, well, I know it's old. I know there's all this great modern technology, but man, it's so cheap. And they go, I can buy a tape for a couple bucks. And you go, well, that's the smallest part of the cost, right?
Yeah.
It's really the whole system replacement, the maintenance, the storage, the guys walking around the data center with tapes in their arms, hoping they didn't forget one. And so this cumbersome, complex technology, it's just time for it to go away. And VTLs are just a wonderful solution to get rid of that old technology. First off, in the world of public clouds with the data centers and the incredible amount of capacity that someone like Amazon has, we have technologies now that allow us to drop in a modern replacement for that, seamlessly integrating tapes with your legacy, your existing Veeam backups. And the most important piece, or there's two really important pieces. The first is the speed. Tapes are really slow, but because you're with VTLs, you get to back up to the cache. You can put SSDs in there if you wanted to speed up that performance. And some people do say, well, how do I back up huge environments to tape? Well, the answer is you don't use physical media, right? And the second is cost. We talked a second ago about how the cost is actually really high for tape. Well, on the counter side, VTLs are really pretty cost-advantageous. And I believe you have a couple of TCO examples, don't you?
Yeah, we'll walk through some examples later of customers that have made the move into AWS for their VTL environments for not only their primary backup, but also for their long-term archives.
Oh, very cool. So, Veeam is an incredibly easy-to-use, powerful piece of software. And we really are great at orchestrating all of that, but we're a piece of software, and we're completely storage agnostic. So regardless of what storage provider, be it EBS in the cloud, or NetApp, or Cisco, or any of the other amazing storage platforms that we support, you still want to find a great way to archive that. And I think the VTL solution is really the perfect combination. So Everett, why don't you dive in and talk a little bit about how that solution works, and more importantly, how it can save our customers money?
Sure. And the first thing that I want to do is kind of set the stage a little bit for traditional storage versus moving to the cloud and using cloud storage. And one of the things that we talk about, and I've spent the last 20 years of my career in storage, so I've sort of lived this from a pretty early stage until now. When you're deploying storage inside of your data center, you're doing enterprise storage, you're typically planning out 3 to 5 years in advance. Yeah. And so that means that you're buying a lot of storage today at what is probably a premium, because the cost on everything drops over time. And so in this example, I'm buying 1 petabyte of raw storage. I then go through and I create RAID groups to protect against disk failure and sort of manage the frame and have hot spares. Now I'm down to 800 terabytes of usable storage. Now I go in and I start to carve that up and I create LUNs and I present LUNs to applications, and suddenly I have 400 terabytes of data. Yet I've purchased 1 petabyte of physical storage and put it in my data center, and that's what I'm managing. And so that's the traditional model. You're paying for a petabyte to protect 400 terabytes of data and make it available. With AWS, we actually give you the ability to pay for what you use. So if you have 400 terabytes of data and you transfer 400 terabytes of data into AWS, that's all that you pay for on a monthly basis. So it is pay for what you use, and you don't have to over provision, and you don't have to do the sort of guessing game of trying to plan out for years in advance. Now at AWS, we do have multiple choices available, and the two that we're really going to be talking about today with our VTL and with Veeam are S3 Standard and Glacier. So you see on the far left side, S3 Standard. S3 has been around for a long time now. That was our first major offering at AWS for storage to the market, and that's really for active data. And that's where you're actively reading, actively writing data. That's where that data is going to live. And as we start to move to the right side of this slide, in the middle is S3 and frequent access. And that's really for applications that are using S3 as their primary storage. And it's a place for you to put that data that you need to have it available very quickly, but you're probably not going to be using it very often. So you get a little bit of a discount there for storing that data and for infrequently accessing it. And then off to the far right, that's where we really start to get into archive storage. And when you're using Veeam and you're creating a copy of your data into the AWS VTL, Storage Gateway VTL, and then you're exporting tapes out into Glacier, and we'll talk through that in just a minute. Glacier is that long-term storage. That's the archive storage. You can really think of it as the equivalent process of taking a tape out of a library, putting it into a box, handing it off to a courier, and then they drive it away and store it. And if you need the data back, you open a ticket, request the tape, and hopefully the paper label is still attached, and you can actually know what's on that tape. And so that's really where Glacier is targeted. And you can see on that slide, the pricing for Glacier gets down into 0.4 cents per gigabyte per month. So it's pretty reasonably priced, especially when you start to compare it to the total cost of ownership of something like a physical tape library. One of the other very important things to understand about the AWS storage architecture is durability. And so with S3 and Glacier, we design for 11 nines of durability. And if you do the math on that, it's pretty amazing what you would have to do or the amount of time that it would take before you have the potential for data loss. And we worked with an outside analyst firm to calculate the durability of tape. And so when you look at Glacier or even S3 at 11 nines of durability, and then you look at tape with 2 copies of data on 2 separate tapes inside one physical location, you have about 4 nines of durability. If you take those 2 copies on tape and split them to 2 physically separate locations, you only gain 1 9, and you're only up to 5 nines of durability. So your primary copy of data, 2 tape backup copies in 2 different locations, and you're less than half of the durability of putting that data inside of S3 or Glacier in AWS. To get that data there, specifically with Veeam, we have the AWS Storage Gateway. And the Storage Gateway helps you build out hybrid environments so that you can connect on-premises applications to AWS storage. And with the File Gateway, the first offering there on the top left-hand side of the slide, that presents an NFS interface into S3. And what's interesting about that is that we don't do anything to obfuscate the data. So that means that any file or data that is written to the NFS interface shows up in S3 in its native format. So it's a way to enable applications that maybe don't speak to the cloud today and let them take advantage of S3. Then we have our volume mode. Volume mode lets you present iSCSI LUNs to applications and take advantage of thin provisioned storage, as well as it works as a data migration tool for existing SAN data today, letting you connect it to the storage gateway, present it to the application, and everything keeps functioning as it would, and we make a copy of that up into AWS. And then the last piece on the slide here in the bottom left corner is tape, or VTL. And this is where the integration with Veeam is really exciting, because we give you the ability to connect to a virtual tape library that's deployed as a virtual machine on premises, and you can take advantage of S3 and Glacier inside of AWS. And all of the different modes of storage gateway are tied into the existing AWS tools that are available. Things like CloudWatch for monitoring, CloudTrail for security auditing, IAM for access and identity management, and even KMS for encryption of the data as it sits inside of AWS. So with the VTL specifically, what we do is provide a local cache. So that means that you have disk, as you mentioned before, you can have high performance disk inside of your data center, so that if you have a large backup or if you have a backup that needs to complete in a short amount of time, you can provision NVMe if you want to, or SSD, or if you need capacity, you can do lots of SATA, and that acts as a local cache, so that when you do the backup, it's written into the storage gateway in tape mode, and you get that representation of a VTL, but all the data is cached there locally, so you get low latency, high speed performance to be able to do that backup. And now the tape gateway is going to present 12 tape drives, 1,500 slots, and a robot. And you can go in and create as many tapes as you want and fill all of those slots with tapes. You don't actually pay for anything until you start to write data. So you can theoretically create 1 million tapes and not write any data to them, and you won't be charged for it. So until you start to consume the service, there are no charges. So each one of those tapes can be up to 2.5 terabytes. That means that inside of the virtual tape library, you can store 1 petabyte of data. And what's really cool about the VTL in the tape gateway is that if a tape is inside of a drive or inside of a slot in the virtual tape library, we're storing that data in S3. So you're getting the benefit of S3, the high performance, the low latency, the 11 nines of durability. If you take one of those tapes and you export it out of the virtual tape library, exactly like you would do today with a physical tape library, and you want to send that tape off-site, you do the same thing, same workflow with the storage gateway VTL. You export the tape out. We actually make a copy of that tape into Glacier, and you're still getting the 11 nines of durability. You're getting the lower cost point. So you're reducing your cost to archive that data and store it for long periods of time, still getting the same durability.
Wow. And
you've freed up space then inside of the VTL where you can create a new tape and write more data. So inside of the VTL, 1 petabyte of capacity on what we call the virtual tape shelf inside of Glacier, unlimited.
And no running around the data center holding.
No running around the data center. Nobody has to manage tapes. There's nothing physical to touch. Once you've deployed the VM, you point Veeam at it and you're good to go.
So easy.
One of the things that I get asked a lot, and I think is really interesting, and we'll talk about this in our user case study later on, is where does the storage gateway write data? I mean, if you look at what we have at AWS, we have regions all around the world. And with the storage gateway, the region that you activate the gateway to is where it's going to store the data. So in this example, you can see that we're probably deployed maybe in San Diego in our data center, but we've activated the storage gateway to US East 1. And so what that means is that the storage gateway VTL is going to save all of those virtual tapes in US East 1, which is in Northern Virginia. And so you're automatically getting a geographic separation of your primary copy of your data and your archive or your backup copy of your data when it gets moved into AWS. And you're getting that for the same cost of just storing that data inside of AWS. And an important thing to note is with the storage gateway, with all of the modes, all of the traffic between your data center and AWS is encrypted. As well, with the tape mode and with the volume mode, we also encrypt the data as it lands on the service on disk. So everything is going to be encrypted when it gets to AWS. With the VTL, we even go so far as we compress it before we encrypt it. So that means that you're getting better utilization of not only your in-data center resources as well as your resources inside of AWS. And I will note, we charge on the compressed price. So if you get 2-to-1 compression, when the data lands inside of AWS, you're paying half the cost of what you would for the full size of the data. So some benefits of doing the migration into AWS Storage Gateway using virtual tapes with Veeam. I think the biggest one is probably it's a seamless workflow. if you're using tape today and you have tape deployed inside of your data center, you can deploy the storage gateway in VTL mode, you can point Veeam at it, and you can keep the same workflow, you can do everything the same way that you've been doing it, only instead of having that physical infrastructure that you have to manage and have to hope that the data is actually there on the tape when you go to do the restore, you're in a virtual environment, both the deployment of the VTL as well as the tape library, and you're getting the benefit of storing that data inside of AWS with 11 nines of durability and a lower cost point. Certainly those things are important. Adding in the security aspect of all of the data being encrypted, both inside the virtual machine as well as when it's being written to AWS, and the ability to write it to any region around the world and have it durably stored and accessible, that usually makes it a pretty easy decision for customers that are looking at making the move over to a virtual environment and moving into AWS with their data. From a cost standpoint, I'd like to share this slide. So this is Sony DADC, and they actually presented all of this data, and their CTO has talked about this a lot. It's interesting the process that they went through when they were determining if they would continue to use tape or if they would start to move into Glacier as their archive tool. And you can see on the left-hand side, the blue line represents running everything on premises, continuing to use tape, and the yellow line across the bottom, that represents moving the data into Glacier. And so you can see that the blue line starts off fairly high, just under $4 million a year, whereas Glacier starts at $1.5 million. And the Glacier line gradually goes up over time, and that's accounting for all of the new data that's being written into Glacier, but it doesn't take into account the cost reductions that AWS does on a fairly regular basis. It has done many times over our last 11 years of existence. So with the blue line, we're starting fairly high up to the left, and then it drops off. And that's because they're buying the new tape library, they're buying media to populate it, they're paying maintenance, they're going through the migration process of moving off of the old tapes onto the new tapes and into the new library. So that cost drops, and then out into year 4 and into year 5, the cost actually drops just a little bit below what it would cost them to run Glacier. But if you do the comparison to the first 2 years, to year 4 and 5, it's a pretty dramatic difference. So even that slightly lower cost in year 4 and 5 does not offset the cost of having a new library, buying media, paying maintenance, and all of those things. And certainly when you got out into year 6, and that was the 6-year refresh cycle, in year 6 the cost shoots up dramatically, and it's more than double what it would cost to have all of that data in Glacier. And so that's where they run into the issue of sort of comparing a long-term total cost of ownership versus just looking at 1 or 2 or even 3 years. You have to go out into a longer period when you start to compare what is the real return and how much is it really costing you every month to be able to have that data stored. And I know that not everyone out there has environments that are in the millions of dollars when it comes to your backup. And so we do have another example here, and this is a much smaller customer. And again, these are numbers that the customer gave to us at AWS for what it costs them every month and every year to be able to store that data. And so you can see that running with on-premises physical tape, they're looking at almost $57,000 a year just to be able to manage that environment. And moving into Storage Gateway VTL, they were able to reduce that to $34,500 per year.
Wow.
So it's a pretty dramatic cost savings, even at a much smaller scale when we're talking about tens of thousands versus millions of dollars per year. And then you add into it the durability and the reliability, the availability, and all the other ilities that you get. It's really a much different environment, and just knowing that your data is available and that you'll be able to get it back and do that restore is something that's pretty powerful. So I did want to talk a minute about a customer. So this is Southern Oregon University, and they've been an AWS customer for a while now, and they're a Veeam customer as well. So they have Veeam deployed to protect their virtual environment. They're doing their backup locally to disk, and then they're creating an archive copy into the Storage Gateway VTL. And Southern Oregon University was actually one of the first customers that I know of that activated to a different region and used it as a DR copy. So you can see on the little map of the U.S. there in Southern Oregon, on the there in the upper left corner of the picture of the U.S. And then they're going to U.S. East 1, which is in Northern Virginia. And so that means for them, they automatically have a disaster recovery copy of the data. If anything happens on the West Coast that takes out their data center or even just damages the storage or the backups, they're able to recover from US East 1, and they have that data thousands of miles away. And that's pretty important. Also, you can see there in the quote that really the setup was very fast. They deployed the virtual machine, they gave it disk, they were able to point Veeam at it and mount it over iSCSI, and it was fairly straightforward, and it was an easy change to make. And at that point, I'm going to hand it back over, and I think we're going to walk through a demo of Veeam with the Storage Gateway VTL.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm really excited about this because one thing that's really cool about this environment, it's actually running entirely inside of AWS, including backing up EC2 instances. I'm going to talk a lot more about that, but first, I just want to show this initial backup job here. This is a pretty standard Veeam deployment. We have a backup job backing up every day and storing that to a local volume. We also over here have a tape job, which is saying whatever is backed up in that initial backup job, let's go ahead and just copy that into tape. And the reason that's really nice to tie directly into a job is because then as you change the job, the tape one's already done.
Right.
And Veeam is all about making things easy. Candidly, I set this up, and I'm definitely not some technical wizard, but this was just so easy to do. If I dive straight into to the tape infrastructure here, we talked for a second about you just kind of present it as iSCSI and it shows these tapes, but it really was very, very simple. All I did was once I set up the tape gateway, which I did through the marketplace,
Yep.
I took that IP address, typed it in the activator, clicked next a couple times, and it was all done. The marketplace took care of the entire setup for me, and we have a very, very similar process for on-prem as well, with OVAs and the Hyper-V files as well.
Yeah.
And then I just dropped the public IP that you gave me in Discovery. It showed me a list of all the targets almost automatically. I clicked connect, and that was all it was. And next thing you know, I went into Veeam, simply clicked over here, clicked add a taped server. Because I presented the iSCSI targets to this individual server, it automatically pre-populated this, knew the credentials. I clicked next a few times, and it popped up right here. I right-clicked, I clicked rescan, and I clicked import tape library. And the import tape library is simply looking out at what tapes are on the VTL,
Yeah.
and it just pulls them straight in. And I can come over here to my online tapes, and you can see that I have two tapes in right here. And if I was to right-click and import tapes, then it's going to go out and connect to that VTL and say what new tapes do we have. And you'll see, in fact, I had a couple more tapes that I had added recently. And
How did you find the process of creating the tapes?
Oh, why don't I show you?
Perfect.
So easy.
That wasn't planned. That was just
You
a
know,
happy
little
accident
bit.
segue.
Yeah. So, this is kind of the one thing that you do have to do manually, unless you were to programmatically do this via APIs, right?
Yeah.
But they make it so simple. All you do is you come here, you select how many tapes you want to create, up to 10. Let's create 3. You select capacity, and I'm going to do 100 gig tapes because I like to see them filled up. And set a prefix, I'll call them demo, and I'll click to create tapes.
So are you familiar with the IoT buttons, the dash buttons that we have available at AWS?
Yes.
So I'm actually working on a project right now, and if anybody out there that's watching is going to reinvent, if you can find me, I'll see if I can have a stash of them available to give away. But we will share the code. We're actually writing code for one of the IoT buttons that every time you press it, you can generate tapes.
Oh,
It's
cool.
a silly little thing, but if you can make 10 tapes at a time just by pressing a button, then you just have to keep it away from your coworkers, because I could see people coming by and
You
generating.
can play a sound too, so like the easy, yeah.
That's a good question.
That'd
We'll
be
look into that.
Pretty cool. But yeah, so that's literally all we had to do. You can see these tapes are in the creating, being created, and And really that was it. So if I jump back into the backend recovery, we can see that those are right here. Media pools I want to talk about here for just a second, because media pools are really cool. The last thing you want to do is just try to like play traffic cop, pointing from tape to tape, which drive and which tape. So media pools simplifies that whole process. And when you actually go to set up this media pool, you actually go into what's called grandfather, father, son, GFS media set, and you just kind of follow the prompts. It's click next, click next, click next. But what's really cool about it is there's a feature in there where when you click the checkbox, it does a couple things. The first is whenever tape goes into the free pool, which you do by simply right-clicking on a tape, move to media pool, and click free. As soon as it goes into free, what it does is as it needs, as soon as the Veeam says, okay, we need a tape, it says, oh, there's a bunch of free tapes. It just grabs one out of that and uses it in that media pool. So anytime that we actually have a backup tape job that runs, in fact, you can see it just jumped in right there. As soon as we do that, it just grabs the tapes it needs and slides it in, and that's it. Veeam has simplified this entire process. But the second button is one that I think is really, really cool, and that is that we can automatically eject and export those tapes. So in the process of the guy putting the tapes in that little armored lunchbox thing and carrying it through the data center, that's all gone, because as soon as that job runs, it's obviously compressed, but it's exported and ejected. And I think that the coolest thing about switching to a cloud-based model is that we don't care how full you fill it, right? You want to make a 1 terabyte tape and your job is 50 gigs? Fine, we'll upload 50 gigs, right?
Absolutely.
You don't have to play this game of what size should I get my tape, and then how do I size it perfectly, and now my tapes are bigger, so now I'm putting things across 3 tapes, and you just pick your size, it'll load it, and when it's done, it exports it, and just that data is uploaded.
Yeah, and you only pay for what you use. And that's the most important part about, moving in from a cost standpoint, so that if you make a terabyte tape and you only write 50 gigs of data, you're only paying for 50 gigs of usage.
So easy. I think there's definitely a savings there, which you showed earlier.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to talk about really, really quickly is, I mentioned that this whole environment's running in AWS. And I think this is actually a really cool use case here. As people deploy EC2 instances, they really do need, obviously you have some that are transactional and come on and come off, but you have a lot of kind of standard applications that run in the cloud and need to have that data protected.
Yes.
And Veeam plugs natively in, and it's so easy. So you'll actually see right here, this is 81.aslab. I actually use the AWS directory service.
Okay.
Spun it up, redundant availability zones, and now all of the servers that I create, I just put on that Windows domain, either Linux or Windows. Veeam instantly scans for them. They pop up immediately. Everything that's inside this protection group, the agents get installed automatically. The user doesn't have to touch a thing. The backup job is tied directly to this protection group. So you create a new EC2 instance, join it to the domain. It pops in here, the agent gets installed automatically, and we really want to use agents for change block tracking and application awareness. And then what happens is, it starts backing up automatically. And then remember that our tape job is protecting that backup job, so then it even archives to a new location of the tape, and all you have to do is join it to the domain.
Right.
You don't even have to touch Veeam.
Yeah, it makes the process of managing your backups much simpler. It's something that, honestly, after you've set it up, you really don't have to think about it a lot anymore. And that's one of the things that I hear a lot when I talk to storage administrators, and we talk about some of the benefits that are available of putting those archive jobs in and even using the Storage Gateway VTL, and certainly with Veeam, is that they can deploy an environment, they know that they're protected, and they don't have to think about it. One of the things that I always like to ask when I'm meeting someone, having a meeting for the first time is, hey, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? And a lot of times it's backup. And I actually heard it mentioned recently that tape backup is, they call it Schrodinger's backup, because the state of the data is unknown until you actually try to read it back and do a restore.
Well, I think actually that's one of the coolest parts about using tape in the cloud, is that anytime you want, you just pick a file. And Veeam actually has some really cool, we don't have time on the demo today, but really cool capabilities to index those files, and I can just search and say, hey, CEO, that spreadsheet that you asked for, I have it on these 6 dates, and which one do you want me to recover?
Right.
And and you can say, well, I can test that. I can say, yeah, it works. rather than having the lunchbox delivered and plugging it in. So if we jump back up here, so we talked a lot at the end there about the agents, and part of Veeam's strategy is protecting those public cloud environments, and so those agents work flawlessly on protecting EC2 instances. And obviously we do on-prem very, very well, and we work with managed service providers. But I think a lot of people didn't realize that we had a great solution coming out very, very, very soon with the centralized management to protect EC2. The other thing that people don't realize that's coming out really soon is for VMware users who are backing up or who are considering going to VMware on AWS. We're one of the only solutions out there that have been announced that is going to be able to manage those backups. So, I mean, you can't, I have a saying that everybody rolls their eyes at when I say, and that's that, you could have the best hot dog in the world at a hot dog stand, but unless you have your condiments, your ketchup, your mustard, your relish, you physically, no one's going to buy that ketchup, no one's going to eat that ketchup or that hot dog. And that's exactly the case. If you're going to go to VMware Cloud and AWS and you don't have a backup strategy, what are you doing? It's worthless to you. And so I think anybody who's even talking about VMware Cloud and AWS should be talking to AWS and talking to Veeam about how we move those backups, because you don't want to put them on vSAN, right? You definitely want to put them on S3. So I think we have some really, really great capabilities there.
Yeah, it's a great joint solution. And as somebody that was born outside of Chicago, I will say that you don't put ketchup on hot dogs.
Oh, man. So as we finish up here, we definitely have some links for people to go to. I did want to remind everybody that I know we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. We did record this whole presentation. We'll do a little bit of editing and we'll get it up on the website very, very soon. I'm sure we'll send a link as well so that people can watch the whole thing. And I know that we have a couple questions that I wanted to address. Somebody asked looks like Mark asked, what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing the cloud option, doing it this way versus our cloud option in Veeam? And I think it's a really great question, because we have tens of thousands of cloud partners that do an amazing job for our customers. And I have a lot of personal history with those guys. And the big difference here is service, right? Using AWS does not preclude you from necessarily using a cloud service provider. In fact, you guys work with a ton of the competency or consulting partners out there.
Yeah.
And it's really how much service the customer needs. If they need that available space for failover, and they need somebody who can hold their hand and look for failures that may happen, if they need somebody that can help them get the entire thing set up and manage it, our cloud providers really provide that level of service. Sometimes that's going to be at their data centers, sometimes that's going to be at AWS's. But our cloud providers really fill that gap of service. AWS is really for the more technical savvy, AWS natively is really for the more technical savvy, kind of, it is just a perfectly engineered box. You really couldn't get better. So that's, in my opinion, the really big difference there.
Yeah, and I think deploying the storage gateway VTL, and you've done it recently, so you've got some hands-on experience. It is fairly straightforward. Yeah, so we certainly see customers doing sort of the managed option where somebody is managing the environment for them, but we also have a lot of smaller customers that have really deployed the storage gateway VTL on their own, because it is fairly straightforward and simple, and even done the full deployment. So it is something that's pretty easy to do, and actually we encourage you to try it. So you can get a free version from Veeam for a trial, as well as from AWS. We'll actually give you some usage for free for a year. So you can go to the AWS website to get more information about the free tier. You can go to the Veeam site to get more information about the trial version of Veeam. And in case you didn't know, we have a conference called reInvent that's coming up later this month that will be in Las Vegas. And I know that Veeam will be there. And I think we even have some joint demos planned in the booth, and some more in-depth presentations where we'll spend a lot of time talking about the intricacies of how Storage Gateway works.
Absolutely, and one thing that's always amazed me at reInvent, if you guys haven't been, is the sheer number of solution architects that attend, who can sit down with whiteboards and just, without even scheduling an appointment, and walk up and say, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. And Veeam is so prevalent. 267,000 customers. Adding something like 4,000 or just over 4,000 customers a month. That a lot of the AWS people are very familiar with our solutions as well. So they're definitely there to help us. We'll be there sponsoring at booth 332. So we're looking forward to seeing you there as well. If you're interested in anything that we brought up or we talked about today, please reach out to your Veeam rep or contact us via some of the contact links I'm sure we'll provide, and we'll send this recording out to you guys at the end. So thank you so much for tuning in today, Everett. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.